The house was silent, so quiet it almost hummed with tension. I sat in my recliner, fingers drumming a steady beat on the leather armrest. In front of me, 3 champagne glasses gleamed under the soft glow of the lamp. Next to them, a bottle chilled in a silver bucket, beads of condensation rolling lazily down its surface. Everything was perfectly arranged, as it always was in my world. Precise. Predictable. Until now. 15 years. That's how long Emma and I had been married. Long enough to build what I thought was an unshakable life. I prided myself on structure, on plans that worked and routines that clicked into place like clockwork. Emma, though, was my opposite. Where I was rigid, she was fluid. Where I thrived on order, she brought spontaneity. Her lightness had always balanced my weight, or so I believed. But recently, the scales had started to tip. I wasn't one to overanalyze or jump to conclusions, but even I couldn't ignore the subtle shifts in her behavior. The late nights at work. The sudden interest in weekend outings with friends whose names seemed to change with every story. The way she angled her phone just enough to keep the screen out of my line of sight. I'd been patient, meticulous even, piecing together the signs like a puzzle I didn't want to complete. Tonight, though, there would be no more guessing. No more doubt. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke through my thoughts. My heart quickened, though my face remained impassive. I adjusted my tie, smoothed the sleeves of my shirt, and leaned back in the chair. My hands found the leather armrests again, gripping them lightly as I stared at the door. It opened moments later, and Emma walked in. She carried her coat draped over her arm, her dark hair spilling over her shoulders, her lips painted a shade of red she hadn't worn in years. Her eyes found mine immediately, widening for just a moment before narrowing in what could only be described as quiet resolve. Then he followed. Brian Foster. I'd never met him in person, but I didn't need an introduction to know who he was. His name had come up too many times in texts Emma had tried to dismiss. His face, though unfamiliar, fit the image I'd imagined, smug, confident, and annoyingly polished. He wasn't bigger or stronger than me, but there was something in the way he carried himself that made my teeth clench. "Chris," Emma said, her voice steady but not quite natural. "This is Brian. We need to talk." Her words hung in the air, the weight of them pressing down on all 3 of us. Brian looked uncomfortable, his hands shoved deep into his pockets as though he might find a way out of this mess in there. Emma, on the other hand, had perfected her composure. She moved to the couch, sitting on the edge as though ready to bolt if things went south. Brian followed her lead, though he kept a careful distance. I gestured to the couch with one hand, my face unreadable. "Sit," I said simply. Emma hesitated, her eyes darting toward Brian before she sank into the cushions. He took his seat beside her, shoulders stiff, movements awkward. My gaze drifted to the champagne glasses, their presence almost mocking now. I picked up the bottle, the cork releasing with a sharp pop that seemed to echo in the tense silence. "Champagne," I said, pouring the first glass and handing it to Emma. She accepted it, her fingers trembling slightly around the stem. The second glass was for Brian, though he barely looked at it before setting it on the table. The third I poured for myself but left untouched, the bubbling liquid catching the light as it settled. "Well," I said after a moment, leaning back in my chair. "You said you needed to talk. I'm listening." Emma took a deep breath, her grip tightening on the glass in her hand. She glanced at Brian, who gave her a small nod of encouragement, though he looked as though he'd rather be anywhere else. "Chris," she began, her voice softer now. "I don't know how to. I've been seeing Brian. For a while. And I think I want a divorce." There it was. The words fell from her lips with the force of a wrecking ball, shattering whatever illusions had been left between us. Brian shifted beside her, his unease now palpable as he fidgeted with his glass. I let the silence linger, watching them both squirm under the weight of it. "I see," I said finally, my voice calm, measured. I gestured toward the couch. "Make yourselves comfortable. This is a conversation worth having properly, don't you think?" Brian looked at Emma again, as though asking for permission. She didn't respond, her posture as rigid as his. Reluctantly, they both settled into the couch, their discomfort filling the room like a physical presence. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, a soft but persistent reminder of the storm brewing inside. The room felt heavier now, the silence stretching into something almost unbearable. I stayed in my recliner, calm on the surface, though every nerve in my body buzzed with tension. Across from me, Emma held her glass tightly, the stem looking fragile in her trembling hand. Brian sat stiffly beside her, his shoulders squared, though he refused to meet my eyes. "Go on, then," I said finally, gesturing for one of them to speak. "I assume there's more to this than the headline you've just delivered." Emma exhaled slowly, her composure threatening to crack. "Chris," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I didn't plan for this to happen. I didn't mean to hurt you." "Ah," I interrupted, leaning forward to rest my elbows on my knees. The classic opening line. "I didn't mean to hurt you." My lips curved into a bitter smile. "Go on. I'm all ears." She hesitated, glancing at Brian as if willing him to take over. He cleared his throat, finally finding his voice. "Chris," Brian began, shifting uncomfortably. "I know this isn't easy to hear, but this wasn't about trying to hurt you. Emma and I, well, we connected. And over time, we realized we wanted to be together." "Connected," I echoed, my tone dry. "That's a polite way of putting it." Brian's face flushed, but he pressed on. "I want to be clear. This isn't just some fling. I care about her deeply. We both felt like this was the right thing, even if it's difficult." "The right thing," I said, the bitterness creeping back into my voice. "So you thought it was the right thing to sneak around behind my back instead of coming to me like an adult?" Emma winced, setting her glass down on the table. "Chris, please don't make this harder than it has to be. I know I made mistakes, but—" "You didn't just make mistakes, Emma," I said sharply. "You made choices. Repeatedly. And now you want to paint this as some kind of star-crossed romance." Emma's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but I didn't let that stop me. Not this time. She reached into her bag and pulled out a slim stack of papers. My stomach sank as she placed them on the table between us. "These are the divorce papers," she said quietly. "I've already signed them. I'm not asking for anything. You can keep the house, the savings, everything. I just want a clean break." I stared at the papers for a long moment, their presence an undeniable reality. "How generous of you," I said, my voice cold. "But let me guess, this is less about generosity and more about getting rid of the guilt, isn't it?" Her eyes darted away, guilt written all over her face. Brian, however, sat up straighter, his discomfort giving way to defensiveness. "Look," he said, his tone firm now, "Emma and I aren't trying to destroy your life, Chris. We're just trying to be honest about what we want. We've both been unhappy in our relationships, and we deserve a chance to find happiness." The audacity of his words nearly made me laugh. I shook my head, leaning back in the chair. "Unhappy," I repeated. "That's your justification. You felt unhappy, so you decided to blow up 2 marriages and expect me to just, what? Wish you both well." Brian's jaw tightened, but he didn't reply. I turned my attention back to Emma, who was avoiding my gaze. "You said you didn't want anything from me, Emma. But I think you've already taken more than you realize. You took my trust. My peace of mind. And now you want me to sign off on your happily ever after." "Chris, she started, but I cut her off. "No," I said firmly. "You've said enough. Now, you're going to listen." The room fell silent again, both of them watching me warily as I prepared to speak. "I've spent 15 years building a life with you, Emma," I said, my voice steady but hard. 15 years believing we were a team. Do you have any idea what it feels like to realize that it was all a lie? To know that while I was working to keep us afloat, you were out looking for greener pastures." Her tears finally spilled over, but I didn't stop. "And you," I said, turning my gaze to Brian. "You waltz into my home and talk about honesty and happiness as if those words mean anything coming from you. If you wanted to be honest, you wouldn't have been sneaking around like a thief in the night. You're not noble, Brian. You're a coward." Brian's face turned an even deeper shade of red, but he didn't argue. For a moment, none of us spoke. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock and Emma's soft, shaky breaths. Finally, I stood, picking up the untouched glass of champagne and raising it slightly in a mock toast. To honesty, I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. May it finally find its way into this room. I drained the glass in one smooth motion, the sharp burn of the drink grounding me in the moment. Setting the empty glass back on the table, I turned to face them both. We're not done here, I said, my voice low and steady. Not by a long shot. I didn't sit back down. Standing over them gave me a sense of control, however illusory it might have been. Emma looked at the floor, her hands twisting in her lap, while Brian shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his attempts at maintaining composure failing miserably. The air between us was dense, heavy with the weight of everything that had been said, and what was still unsaid. You think this is about happiness, I said, my voice calm but deliberate, but it's not. It's about convenience. You took the easy way out, Emma. Instead of working on the marriage you committed to, you decided to rewrite the rules without telling me. And you, I said, turning my attention to Brian, played the willing accomplice. Chris, Emma said softly, it's not like that. Then enlighten me, I snapped, leaning forward. What exactly is it like? She hesitated, her lips parting and closing as if she were searching for the right words. Finally, she sighed and met my gaze, tears brimming in her eyes. I felt lost. For a long time. You've always been so focused on work, on making sure everything was perfect, that I felt invisible. Invisible. I repeated, my voice incredulous. You felt invisible, so your solution was to betray me. Do you have any idea how much of myself I poured into this marriage? Into making sure you had everything you needed, everything you wanted. She flinched at the harshness of my tone, but I didn't stop. I trusted you, Emma. Implicitly. Do you know how rare that is for someone like me? And you threw it away for, what? I gestured toward Brian, whose expression darkened at the implication. Emma's tears spilled over now, her hands trembling as she tried to wipe them away. I'm not saying it was right, she said, her voice cracking. I didn't know how to tell you how unhappy I was. You start by telling the truth, I said coldly. But I guess that was too much effort. Brian cleared his throat, clearly trying to assert himself. Look, he said, his voice firming up, Emma's not the only one at fault here. Maybe if you'd been paying more attention to her. Stop right there, I said sharply, cutting him off. I turned to face him fully, my body tense. You don't get to lecture me about my marriage. You're the outsider. The interloper. If you think this mess gives you the moral high ground, you're delusional. Brian opened his mouth to reply but thought better of it. He sank back into the couch, avoiding my glare. I straightened up, running a hand through my hair as I tried to collect my thoughts. The weight of their betrayal felt suffocating, but I wasn't going to let it crush me. Not in front of them. Emma, I said, my voice steadier now, do you even realize the ripple effect of what you've done? It's not just about you and me. This affects everyone, our friends, our families, and especially our kids. Her face paled at the mention of our children. Chris, please. No, I said firmly. You don't get to plead with me now. Do you think they won't find out? That they won't be hurt by this? Because they will. And you'll have to explain to them why their mother decided that chasing happiness was more important than the family we built. Her shoulders slumped, and she looked away, unable to meet my eyes. And Brian, I said, turning my attention back to him. Did you think about your family? Your wife? Or was she just collateral damage in your little pursuit of connection? He looked uncomfortable, but to his credit, or his stupidity, he tried to defend himself. My marriage was over long before Emma came along, he said quietly. I just didn't have the courage to end it. How noble, I said, my sarcasm biting. So instead of ending it, you decided to compound your failures by ruining someone else's marriage too. Truly inspiring. Brian's face reddened, but he said nothing. The silence stretched between us, punctuated only by the faint ticking of the clock. Here's what's going to happen, I said, my tone brooking no argument. "I'll sign the papers, but not tonight. I'm going to review every word of that agreement, and if there's even a hint that you're hiding something, Emma, I'll fight you for every last inch." Emma nodded silently, her tears still falling. "And as for you," I said, fixing Brian with a cold stare, "you'd better pray you don't cross paths with me again. Because the next time you do, this conversation won't be nearly as civil." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, but again, he stayed silent. I stepped back and gestured toward the door. "You've said what you came to say. Now get out of my house." Emma looked at me, her expression one of desperation and heartbreak, but I refused to waver. After a moment, she stood, her movements slow and hesitant. Brian followed her lead, avoiding my gaze as he shuffled toward the door. They left without another word, the door clicking shut behind them. For a moment, the silence felt deafening. Then, the weight of what had just happened hit me all at once, and I sank back into the recliner, staring at the untouched glass of champagne. The silence in the house was suffocating after they left. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, indifferent to the wreckage they'd left behind. I sat there in the recliner, staring at the untouched glass of champagne on the table. My mind was a whirlwind, flipping between anger, disbelief, and something far heavier, the creeping realization that everything I thought I knew about my life had been a lie. I needed to move. Sitting there would let the despair creep in, and I wasn't ready to surrender to that, not yet. I stood up abruptly, grabbed the champagne glasses, and dumped their contents into the sink. The bottle went into the trash with a clatter that felt cathartic. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I went into the office and pulled out an old notebook, one Emma had given me years ago when I first got promoted. The leather cover was worn, but it felt sturdy in my hands. I flipped to a blank page and started writing, a list, if you could call it that. It was a strategy, a plan to take control of what I could. Talk to a lawyer. Gather all the financial documents. Speak to the kids before they hear it from anyone else. I underlined the third point twice. Emma might have left me blindsided, but I wouldn't let her spin this mess into something palatable for the kids. They deserved the truth, or at least a version of it that didn't paint me as the villain. By sunrise, I had a clear enough head to take the first step. I called a lawyer recommended by a coworker, Rebecca Morris. She was direct and efficient, and she didn't sugarcoat anything during our initial phone consultation. "You need to document everything," she said. "Bank statements, texts, emails, anything that shows how this relationship developed and its impact on your marriage. And don't sign anything until I've reviewed it." I assured her I hadn't and promised to send over the signed divorce papers Emma had left. "Good," she said. "We'll take it from there. But be prepared, Chris. These things tend to get ugly, especially when there's deception involved." I thanked her and hung up, feeling a strange mix of dread and determination. If Emma and Brian thought I'd roll over and let them dictate how this ended, they were sorely mistaken. That afternoon, I called Hannah and Matt, our two kids. Hannah was finishing her freshman year at college, while Matt was still in high school. I asked them to come home that evening, saying I needed to talk to them about something important. Hannah arrived first, her usual smile fading when she saw my face. "Dad, what's going on?" she asked, dropping her bag on the couch. Matt walked in a few minutes later, headphones slung around his neck. He paused in the doorway, sensing the tension in the air. "This doesn't look good," he said cautiously. I took a deep breath, motioning for them to sit. "There's no easy way to say this," I began. "Your mom and I are getting a divorce." Hannah's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Matt just stared at me, his expression unreadable. "Why?" he finally asked, his voice quiet but firm. "It's complicated," I said, choosing my words carefully. "Your mom has been seeing someone else." Hannah gasped, tears welling in her eyes, while Matt's jaw tightened. "Who?" he demanded. "Someone she works with," I said. "His name is Brian." Matt stood abruptly, pacing the room like a caged animal. "This is such crap," he muttered under his breath. Hannah was crying now, her shoulders shaking. "How long has this been going on?" she asked. "For a while," I admitted, the words bitter on my tongue. "I didn't know until recently." The silence that followed was thick with anger, sadness, and disbelief. Finally, Matt stopped pacing and turned to face me. "What happens now?" "I'm working with a lawyer to make sure this gets handled properly," I said. "You'll both stay here with me. Your mom, she made her choice." "Does she know we're here?" Hannah asked, her voice trembling. "She knows," I said. "But I wanted to talk to you first. You deserve to hear it from me." By the time they left the room, my heart felt like it had been through a grinder. I hated seeing my kids in pain, but I also knew they needed to see the truth. If Emma had her way, she'd try to downplay everything, painting herself as a victim of circumstance instead of the architect of this disaster. A few hours later, Hannah came back into the living room with her phone in hand. "Mom just texted me," she said, her face pale. "She wants to talk." "Let her," I said. "But don't let her manipulate you. You're old enough to decide for yourselves how you feel about this, but you need all the facts first." Hannah nodded slowly, though I could see the conflict in her eyes. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with Rebecca's words echoing in my head, "These things tend to get ugly." The house felt emptier than ever, even with Hannah and Matt under the same roof. They'd retreated to their rooms, each processing the truth in their own way. I didn't blame them for needing space, I needed it too. But I couldn't afford to wallow in the silence. Not yet. I was halfway through organizing financial documents for Rebecca when my phone buzzed on the counter. Emma's name lit up the screen, and for a moment, I debated letting it go to voicemail. But I knew her too well. If she didn't get an answer, she'd just show up, and I wasn't ready for her to play the victim in front of the kids. I picked up, keeping my tone neutral. "Emma." "Chris," she said, her voice soft, almost pleading. "We need to talk." "I think we've said all we need to say," I replied, my grip tightening around the phone. "Not in front of the kids," she said quickly. "Just us. Please." For a moment, I considered telling her no. But the thought of her spinning more half-truths to Hannah and Matt made me agree. "Fine. Come by tomorrow morning. The kids will be at school." "Thank you," she said, relief evident in her voice. "I'll see you then." I hung up without saying goodbye. The next morning, the sun broke through the blinds, casting long shadows across the living room. I sat on the couch, waiting for her. The folder of documents I'd been compiling for Rebecca was on the coffee table, a silent reminder of how far things had unraveled. When Emma arrived, she looked different, smaller somehow. Her usually confident posture was gone, replaced by a hesitance that felt foreign coming from her. She stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room before landing on me. "Chris," she started, her voice trembling. "I just want to." "Don't," I interrupted, holding up a hand. "If you came here to apologize, save it. We're past that." Her mouth snapped shut, her expression wavering between guilt and frustration. She sat down across from me, folding her hands tightly in her lap. "I didn't come here to argue," she said finally. "I wanted to explain." "Explain what?" I asked, my tone sharp. "That you've been lying to me for months. That you've been sneaking around while I was here keeping this family together." She flinched at my words but pressed on. "Chris, I know I hurt you. I know I destroyed your trust, and I'm sorry. But I wasn't trying to hurt you. I felt like I didn't matter to you anymore." I let out a bitter laugh. "Didn't matter? Emma, I worked my ass off for this family. I made sacrifices you didn't even notice because I thought we were a team. And now you're telling me you felt invisible." She looked down, tears brimming in her eyes. "I'm not excusing what I did," she said softly. "But I was lonely, Chris. You were always so focused on work, on keeping everything perfect. I felt like I was just there. Like I didn't exist outside of being a wife and a mother." Her words stung, but they didn't break me. I'd spent too many nights thinking about her excuses, about the cracks she claimed had been there all along. "And instead of talking to me, you found someone else to fill the gap," I said, my voice cold. "Do you even realize what you've done to this family? To the kids?" Her tears spilled over now, her shoulders shaking. "I've spoken to them," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. They're angry. They hate me. They don't hate you, I said flatly. But they're hurt. And you need to own that. You don't get to waltz back in here and act like this is something we can just move past. I'm not trying to, she said, looking up at me with red-rimmed eyes. I know I can't fix this. But I want to be there for Hannah and Matt. I don't want them to think I've abandoned them. You're going to have to work for that, I said. Because right now, you've left them questioning everything they thought they knew about their mother. Her sobs quieted, and she nodded slowly. I'll do whatever it takes. Good, I said. Because the one thing you can't walk away from is being their mother. But don't think for a second that this means I'm letting you off the hook. She didn't reply, just wiped her eyes and stood up. As she moved toward the door, I spoke again, my voice low but firm. You should know something, Emma. This isn't just about the affair. It's about the person you've become, the lies, the betrayal, the selfishness. That's what I can't forgive. She stopped, her back to me, her head bowed. I understand, she said quietly. And then she walked out, leaving the door to swing shut behind her. This left me drained but resolute. Emma's explanations didn't erase her actions, and her promises didn't rebuild the trust she'd shattered. But it was a step, however small, in the direction of closure. Later that day, Rebecca called with updates about the divorce proceedings. We've got everything we need, she said. Now it's just about making sure you come out of this with what's fair. Fair, I repeated, staring out the window. That's all I'm asking for. The road ahead was far from clear, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of control. The days that followed were consumed by preparation. Rebecca's advice echoed in my mind, document everything. So, that's what I did. Every bank statement, every receipt, every piece of evidence that painted a picture of Emma's betrayal and the consequences it had left in its wake. If she thought she could walk away without accountability, she was sorely mistaken. I hadn't heard much from Emma since our last conversation. The kids avoided talking about her too, which told me they weren't ready to deal with her yet. Hannah stayed buried in her schoolwork, and Matt threw himself into his basketball practices. Watching them try to cope in their own ways only steeled my resolve. Rebecca called one morning with updates. Chris, I've reviewed the financials and the signed papers she left. It's an interesting move, offering you everything without a fight. She's trying to absolve herself, I said bitterly. Maybe, Rebecca replied, but we're not letting our guard down. I've already flagged some concerns about shared accounts and her use of joint funds in the months leading up to this. My grip on the phone tightened. What did you find? There's evidence that she's been withdrawing significant amounts, likely to cover her expenses with Brian. Hotel stays, dinners, travel. It's all there. I felt my blood run cold. She used our money to fund her affair? Rebecca's voice was calm but firm. Yes. And we can use this. It demonstrates a clear breach of marital responsibility, which will help you secure a favorable settlement. I nodded, though she couldn't see me. What do you need me to do? Stay the course, she said. We're filing a counterclaim to ensure she's held accountable for this. It'll also give you leverage in custody discussions if that becomes an issue. Custody. The thought hadn't crossed my mind until then, but now it loomed large. That evening, I sat Hannah and Matt down to explain the next steps. They deserved to know what was happening, even if I wanted to shield them from the uglier details. I spoke with the lawyer, I began, my tone measured. We're moving forward with the divorce. Matt frowned, his hands shoved into his hoodie pockets. Is Mom fighting it? She's not, I said. At least, not yet. But there are complications. Hannah shifted uncomfortably on the couch. What kind of complications? I sighed, choosing my words carefully. Your mom used some of our money, joint money, to cover expenses for her relationship with Brian. Matt's jaw tightened. She spent your money on him. Our money, I corrected. The money that was supposed to support this family. Hannah looked away, tears glistening in her eyes. What happens now? Now, I said, we make sure she's held responsible for her actions. The lawyer is handling it, but I want you both to know that whatever happens, this isn't your burden to carry. You've both been through enough. Matt stood abruptly, pacing the room. I don't get it. Why would she do this? Wasn't this family enough for her? I don't have answers for that, I admitted, my voice heavy. But I promise you this, we'll get through it. All of us. The following week, I received an unexpected call from Rebecca. Chris, Emma's hired her own lawyer. I wasn't surprised, but it still stung. Let me guess, they're pushing back on the financials. Not yet, she said, but they filed a motion to negotiate joint custody. It seems she's trying to rebuild some ground with the kids. The words hit like a punch to the gut. She thinks she can just waltz back into their lives after everything. She might think it's her right as their mother, Rebecca said. But her actions have consequences, and we'll make sure the court sees that. The custody hearing will be crucial. I felt a surge of anger. She's the one who left. She's the one who put Brian ahead of this family. She doesn't get to play the victim now. And she won't, Rebecca assured me. But you need to be prepared. Custody battles aren't just about the past, they're about what's in the kids' best interest moving forward. Stay calm, stay focused, and trust the process. The day of the custody hearing arrived, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Emma sat at one table with her lawyer, looking polished but strained. I sat at the other, Rebecca beside me, her demeanor cool and confident. The judge began by outlining the purpose of the hearing, to determine a custody arrangement that prioritized the kids' well-being. Both sides presented their cases, and as Rebecca laid out the evidence of Emma's actions, I saw her mask of composure falter. Emma's lawyer argued that she deserved joint custody, emphasizing her role as their mother and her desire to rebuild trust. But when Rebecca presented the financial records, along with statements from Hannah and Matt expressing their anger and mistrust, it was clear the judge wasn't convinced. By the end of the day, the ruling was clear: primary custody awarded to me, with Emma granted limited visitation until she could demonstrate stability and repair her relationship with the kids. Emma's face crumpled as the decision was read, but I felt no sympathy. She had made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. When we got home, Hannah and Matt were waiting anxiously. I explained the outcome, and for the first time in weeks, I saw relief on their faces. "So we're staying here?" Matt asked. "Yes," I said. "This is your home, and it always will be." Hannah hugged me tightly, and Matt gave me a nod that spoke volumes. For the first time since the storm had hit, I felt like we were finding solid ground again. But this wasn't the end. Not yet. The custody ruling felt like a victory, but it was a hollow one. There were no winners here, not really. Emma had made her choices, and the damage was done, but now the responsibility of putting the pieces back together fell squarely on me. The kids deserved stability, something real to hold onto after everything that had been torn apart. The first night after the hearing, we had dinner together at the kitchen table. It was quiet at first, the weight of the day still hanging over us. But then Matt started talking about a basketball game he was looking forward to, and Hannah chimed in about her plans to volunteer at a local animal shelter during the summer. It wasn't much, but it was something. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was a glimmer of normalcy. Emma's reach for redemption. A week later, Emma called. I stared at her name flashing on my phone for a long moment before finally answering. "What do you want, Emma?" I asked, my tone measured. She hesitated, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "I want to see the kids." "They'll decide when they're ready," I said firmly. "I'm not going to force them to talk to you." "Chris, I'm trying," she pleaded. "I know I've done horrible things, but they're still my children. I want to fix this." Her words sounded sincere, but I couldn't ignore the part of me that doubted her motives. "You don't get to decide the timeline for their forgiveness," I said. "They're still processing everything, and you need to respect that." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Please, just tell them I love them." I sighed. "I will. But don't push them, Emma. Let them come to you when they're ready." In the weeks that followed, I focused on creating new routines for the kids and me. Hannah and I started going for evening walks, something we hadn't done since she was little. It became our time to talk, sometimes about the big things, sometimes about nothing at all. Matt, ever the athlete, dragged me out to the driveway to shoot hoops. I hadn't touched a basketball in years, but watching his smile light up when I finally sunk a three-pointer made the sore muscles worth it. The house started to feel like a home again. Not the same home it had been before Emma's betrayal, but something new, something built on the ashes of what had been. Eventually, the kids agreed to see Emma. Their decision came with hesitation and conditions: public places only, no overnight stays, and no Brian. I respected their boundaries and made it clear to Emma that they were non-negotiable. Their first meeting was at a coffee shop. I stayed in the parking lot, giving them space but close enough to step in if needed. When they came back to the car, Hannah's eyes were red, and Matt's expression was unreadable. "She cried a lot," Hannah said softly. Matt shrugged. "She said she's sorry." "Guess that's something." "How do you feel about it?" I asked, keeping my voice gentle. Hannah shook her head. "I don't know yet. It's hard to trust her." "That's okay," I said. "You don't have to have all the answers right now." Months passed, and life began to find a rhythm again. Emma kept trying, arranging visits with the kids when they allowed it, but the relationship was fragile. I didn't stand in the way of their efforts to rebuild, but I also didn't sugarcoat her actions when they had questions. They deserved honesty, even when it was painful. As for me, I started therapy, a suggestion from Rebecca that I initially dismissed but eventually embraced. It was a space to unpack the anger, the betrayal, and the grief over the life I thought I had. Through therapy, I realized something important: my role as a father, my connection with my kids, and my own self-worth didn't hinge on Emma's choices. Her betrayal didn't define me, it defined her. One evening, as the kids and I sat around the table playing cards, Matt looked up and said, "You know, Dad, I think we're okay." "Like, we're going to be okay?" Hannah nodded, a small smile on her face. "Yeah. It's not perfect, but it's better." "You're better." Their words hit me harder than I expected, filling me with a sense of pride and relief I hadn't felt in months. We weren't the same family we had been, but we were still a family. And that was enough. What do you think of Chris's journey? Do you think he handled things the right way, or would you have done something differently?